4 children for sale. Have you ever imagined a moment so desperate that a mother is forced to sell her own children? Not in a movie, not in fiction, but in real American history. A broken porch, 4 silent children. One handwritten sign, 4 children for sale. No screams, no violence, only hunger, poverty, and a choice no parent should ever face. This is not just a photograph. It is a question that still haunts us today. What would you do when survival demands everything? In 1948, a photograph taken in Chicago Heights, Illinois documented a moment of quiet, devastation that would later become one of the most haunting images in American social history. 4 small children sat on the worn wooden porch of a modest home. Their clothes were thin, their posture still, and their expressions distant. In front of them rested a roughly handwritten sign that read, 4 children for sale. There was no spectacle, no visible violence, and no outward chaos, only silence and surrender. Standing nearby was their mother, Lucille Chalifou, her face turned away from the camera. Whether she hid her face to shield herself from public judgment or because she could no longer bear to confront her own, reflection remains unknown. What is certain is that the photograph captured a mother at the edge of human endurance. She was not posing for sympathy. She was confronting survival. The image was taken by a photographer from the Vedette Messenger newspaper and was published shortly thereafter. Within days, it spread across the United States, provoking shock, outrage, and disbelief. Many questioned how such a scene could exist in a modern nation. Others condemned the mother without understanding the circumstances that forced her hand. America in the late 1940s was still recovering from the aftermath of World War II. While the nation celebrated victory abroad, countless families at home faced unemployment, housing insecurity, and severe food shortages. Economic instability was widespread, particularly among working-class households. Social safety nets were limited, and for families without extended support, desperation often arrived quietly and without warning. Lucille and her husband, Ray Chalifou, were among those crushed by this reality. They had lost stable housing, struggled to find consistent work, and were unable to provide even the most basic necessities for their children. Food was scarce, shelter was uncertain, medical care was unattainable. With no assistance forthcoming and no viable alternatives, Lucille faced an impossible decision: allow her children to starve with her, or release them into the hands of strangers in the hope that they might survive. The sign placed before the children was not a transaction in the traditional sense. It was a public admission of defeat. It was a plea born of exhaustion, fear, and love distorted by desperation. Lucille was not selling her children because she wanted to. She did so because she believed it was the only remaining way to keep them alive. The photograph itself contains no cries, no movement, and no resistance. Its power lies in its stillness. The children do not reach out. The mother does not explain herself. Poverty speaks through absence, through what cannot be said, and through what has already been lost. This single image froze a moment in time, but it did not capture the full cost that would unfold in the years that followed. Within 2 years of the photograph's publication, the lives captured in that single frame were permanently altered. The 4 children on the porch and the 5th child Lucille Chalifou was pregnant with at the time were separated from one another, scattered into different homes, foster arrangements, and adoptive situations. What began as an act of desperation to preserve, life became a fracture that could never fully be repaired. There was no unified plan for the children's future. In mid-20th century America, adoption and foster care systems were inconsistent, loosely regulated, and often indifferent to the emotional well-being of children from impoverished families. Records were incomplete. Oversight was minimal. Once the children were taken, sibling bonds were treated as expendable details rather than essential human connections. For Lucille, the separation marked the beginning of a lifelong grief. Though the photograph made her momentarily famous, it did not bring lasting help or stability. Public attention faded quickly. But the consequences of her decision did not. She lived with the knowledge that her children were alive somewhere in the world, yet unreachable, unnamed in her daily life and growing up without one another. Each child's path unfolded differently, shaped by chance rather than choice. Some were taken into households that provided basic care but little affection. Others experienced neglect or emotional distance, never fully accepted as family members. A few endured harsher realities, including exploitation and abuse, a tragic irony, considering the original intent behind their mother's decision. The absence of a shared identity followed them into adulthood. Without siblings to reflect their past, many grew up with unanswered questions about who they were and where they came from. Some were never told the truth about their origins. Others learned fragments, rumors, partial explanations, or censored versions of their history that failed to capture the gravity of what had happened. Meanwhile, the image itself continued to circulate quietly in archives, textbooks, and newspaper retrospectives. Detached from its human aftermath, it became a symbol often discussed, rarely investigated. For decades, the photograph spoke louder than the voices of the children it depicted. It was not until years later that journalists and researchers began tracing the lives behind the sign. What they uncovered was not a single narrative of tragedy or triumph, but a complex spectrum of outcomes. Pain did not affect each child equally, nor did resilience manifest in the same way. Some struggled throughout their lives with instability, broken relationships, and unresolved anger. Others, against remarkable odds, managed to build meaningful lives, finding purpose, forming families, and reclaiming control over their identities. What united them was not success or suffering alone, but endurance. Each child carried the invisible weight of a decision made before they were old enough to understand it. Their lives became evidence of how poverty does not end at the moment of survival. It extends forward, shaping futures in ways that are often unseen and unacknowledged. The photograph recorded a single act of surrender. The years that followed revealed its true cost. In the years that followed, the photograph of the 4 children seated beneath a sign reading, "4 children for sale," took on a life far beyond the individuals it portrayed. It became part of America's visual memory, a quiet but devastating record of what poverty can force people to do when society fails to protect its most vulnerable. Yet its deepest meaning does not lie in shock or outrage. It lies in reflection. The image contains no visible cruelty, no raised hands, no shouting faces, no violence in motion. And yet, it represents one of the most severe forms of human suffering. The moment when a parent believes that love alone is no longer enough to keep her children alive. This is the cruelty of poverty at its most extreme, not loud, but absolute. Lucille Chalifou was often judged harshly in the decades that followed, particularly by those who viewed her decision through the lens of morality rather than circumstance. But history, when examined honestly, reveals that her choice was not an act of abandonment. It was an act shaped by hunger, homelessness, and a lack of institutional support. In an era with limited welfare systems and little public accountability, desperation frequently replaced dignity. The photograph reminds us that poverty is not simply the absence of money. It is the erosion of choice. It dismantles families, fractures identities, and strips people of the ability to plan for tomorrow. When survival becomes the only priority, even the most sacred bonds can be sacrificed in the hope, however fragile, that life might continue. Years after the image was taken, the surviving children's stories emerged as quiet testimonies to human resilience. While some carried lifelong scars, others demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to rebuild. They forged careers, formed families, and reclaimed agency over lives that had once been defined by a handwritten sign. Their strength does not erase their suffering, but it stands as proof that broken beginnings do not always dictate broken endings. Still, resilience should never be mistaken for justification. That some survived and succeeded does not absolve the conditions that made such suffering possible. The photograph challenges societies past and present to examine how easily economic hardship can push ordinary people into extraordinary despair. Today, the image endures not because it is sensational, but because it is honest. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That poverty can silence love, that survival can demand unbearable choices, and that indifference can be as destructive as cruelty. It speaks to the responsibility of communities and governments to intervene before desperation becomes destiny. This photograph is not merely something to be seen, it is something to be remembered. Not with judgment, but with understanding. Not as a relic of a cruel past, but as a warning that remains relevant. When families are left alone to face hunger and homelessness, history does not disappear. It repeats itself quietly on another broken porch. And that is why this image, even decades later, is not forgotten. This story teaches us that poverty is not a lack of character, but a failure of support. When society turns its back, even love can be forced into heartbreaking decisions. True progress is measured by how we protect families before desperation takes everything from them. If stories like this help you understand history, humanity, and the hidden cost of poverty, please like, share, and subscribe to support meaningful storytelling and real historical narratives. Your support keeps these forgotten voices alive.